All right, it's time. The people have waited long enough. Okay, welcome, comrades. Happy Pride Month. Big shout out to our LGBTQ plus comrades today. How are you all keeping? That was a wild, tumultuous 10 minutes. My computer blue screened. We had to set up the call about 3 different times. There's just a whole different mess, many different messes on top of each other. And but here we are. We're here now to bring you a conversation about Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And thank you all for joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. And I'm sure this is going to be a really interesting and exciting conversation with Brianna from Rad Reads, diving into a really key foundational text for anyone who's interested in revolutionary anti-colonial struggle. Just before we get started, I do want to inform everyone that I'm going to be on camera a lot less from now on, just for security and safety reasons, obviously. Hence the little avatar you're seeing now where my video usually went. So now I've become a disembodied cartoon head, joining the greats like Hugh Gopnik and so on. So today we are joined by Brianna from Rad Reads. Brianna is a comrade with an excellent channel that I hope you all go subscribe to right away, linked in the description box below. They describe themselves as a black radical booktuber, a student of MLM and Pan-Africanism. So Brianna, thank you for taking the time out to come on the stream. Please introduce yourself to the audience, telling people a little bit about your background, your political ideology, how you came to the left generally, and so on.
Well, thanks, Paul, for having me. I'm very glad to be on your stream today. I'm Brianna. I use they, them pronouns. A little bit about me outside of being a booktuber. I used to be in school. I was studying political science as well as sociology and women's studies. So I have a little bit of a background in that. My current politics are as in my description. I am actively studying Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, as well as Pan-Africanism. And what was one of your questions, how my politics got here? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I suppose how you came to the left generally and how you've come to be, as you say now, like a student of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism and Pan-Africanism.
So, the first, I guess, election I could vote in was the 2016, the dreaded 2016 election.
All too well.
And that was, very much kind of a Bernie Sanders, I'll die on that hill kind of type. And that was kind of my first kind of understanding of even just socialism colloquially may not be accurate, but, hearing it a lot. And, I did some work with my local Democratic Party and an interest group. And I was really disappointed in my very short time working there. And so coupled with the election and some personal political things I was doing, I was like, okay, this is clearly not it. Something else has to be there. And so this also coincided with me wanting to read more and develop and create this booktube channel. So I wanted to read more. I started doing that. And, political science, that's my jam. So I started reading more of that kind of stuff. And that's how I came across eventually Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and Pan-Africanism. I think like two pinnacle texts for that, for Maoism, would be J. Mufawad Paul's Continuity and Rupture Philosophy in the Maoist Terrain, Malcolm X Speaks, and By Any Means Necessary. Those are kind of the two texts that set me on the path that I am on now and that I am still going through.
Brilliant. Yeah, I was also JMP build as well. Very much got me into it. I haven't read the Malcolm X text, but it sounds absolutely fantastic. I was also similar kind of vibes in 2016. That was when I, started to take politics, got active in terms of theory and practice, and so we've had kind of a similar development in many regards. So it's really interesting. And also, I thought it was quite interesting that you specifically describe it as a booktube channel. You know, a left wing booktube channel, which I think is really interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about this. What made you start a YouTube channel, and specifically a left wing booktube channel? You didn't go in for like, you know, LeftTube or BreadTube or, you know, TreadTube or, you know, whatever the cool kids are calling it these days.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank God.
You touched the bullet.
It started right, like, super early. So, like, the booktube channel was, I just wanted to be part of the booktube community, which, you know, depending on who you are and for better or for worse, is a pretty apolitical space on YouTube. It is literally just people talking about reading, and it has its own kind of cultural norms and all these kinds of things. It's really cool. But one thing I wish it had was more nonfiction. Like that already was something that was severely lacking. And then more political stuff, but that wasn't like the overt goal. I just wanted to be there. But over time, as I was reading more, just like I was talking about my political journey, it's very much tied into the channel. So I do not recommend you do this. I mean, unless you are a sadist. If you go back and see how my channel has progressed, you'll see that development. And so about this time last year is when I decided, you know, I'm not leaving BookTube, but my BookTube channel is going to be overtly from the left, overtly Black radical. And so I've been working on that ever since.
Brilliant. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you made some really good videos, and definitely one recently about Frantz Fanon's Wretched Up the Earth and the struggle to come to terms with it. So I definitely recommend, comrades, check that out as well. If you're looking for more, look for more, and a good place to start, you know. And I wanted to ask. This is something we brought up a little bit before the stream. We sort of touched on this before the stream, and I want to ask now before I forget. You mentioned Black radicalism specifically, and I wonder if you could sort of touch on this question now. Maybe it'll be more appropriate to touch on this question a little bit later, and how this ties into, I suppose, the idea of Black nationhood versus New African nationhood, and what that means for like a national liberation struggle. I know that Sales was quite critical of it. Maybe we'll return to that later. James Yaki Sales, Meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. We'll dive back into that. But that's one of the questions that I really wanted to, you know, hear your thoughts on over the course of the stream. So I'm not sure if you wanted to take that now, or if you think it'd be better for us to maybe talk a little bit about Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth first. Which way would you like to take it?
Well, I can plant a little seed so that, you know, maybe our viewers can think about this as we are going through, and then I can maybe tap in a bit deeper. But I will say, you know, Black radicalism as a tradition, or as Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly has argued, is a series of traditions. It is something that goes beyond kind of what the U.S. settler colonial states dictates as appropriate Black political expression in this place. So Black radicalism goes against that grain. And like any body of political thought, it's got a lot of different streams cutting through it. But one that is relevant to our discussion is seen in the Black Power movement in the U.S., which was very different and came out of, in a way, the civil rights movement and its failures, which is what some people, and I would argue the same, was a failure. So Black Power was kind of an answer. Where do we go from here? You know, as MLK would posit. So Black radicalism has a very, very long history. It goes back as far as we were ever held captive here. And it is much more expansive than just the U.S. It goes everywhere. And that's how you see these blends of, you know, Pan-African, New African, all these kinds of things. They're very interwoven. So we're going to see that. And Fanon was part of a very large project of that. Even if he didn't call himself like a self-prescribed Pan-Africanist, his thought is very important to that movement and to that kind of ideological development.
If that's just the seeds, I can't wait to see what the flavors into.
Yeah. Let me make, you know, real small here and talk for 5 minutes. You know?
No, that was absolutely brilliant. I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for giving us that sort of framing to move forward with today. Now let's dive into it. This text, Frantz Fanon's "The Wretched of the Earth." What is this book, Frantz Fanon's "The Wretched of the Earth," about? What is the Wretched of the Earth?
That's also a loaded question. There's a lot of things that it can seem to be on its face, and it's kind of a, I don't like this word, but a very kaleidoscopic text. But the first thing that comes to mind is it is concerned with the psychology of the colonized. Other people rightfully call it a handbook to revolution, and an indictment of Western colonialism, or even applying Marxism, stretching Marxism to deal with the colonial question. And Fanon has a lot of different voices in this text, and he's dealing with national liberation, independence, and what could happen if certain precautions and certain actions are not taken into account during the decolonization struggle. So there's a lot we can start with in this book, to say the least.
Yeah, there's so much. There's so much there. I mean, because really, as you mentioned, it expands across the entire process of national liberation. But during that process, during the war of national liberation, it deals with this socially and individually, getting into like the subjective and psychological impact of these things, and then also post national liberation. It gets into afterwards. What happens? What comes after? What does it mean for nationalism, and what was potentially before quite revolutionary can become quite reactionary, especially the bourgeois nationalists and so on after the revolution, and you can see what they do. And this is a text that for me is so I don't even know how to say this without sounding like really cheesy. It just, there's so many aspects of this text which are really universal for the anti-colonial experience, and there's like a bunch of like little quotes that I was reading this and I was just like, Jesus Christ, he's just describing the Irish national liberation struggle. He's describing exactly, like almost like word for word, what happened in so many different of our situations that we've had here. And I know, of course, it's very different. He's primarily writing about kind of the Algerian war of national liberation,
Right.
and it's still so universally applicable, which is it really blew my mind. I don't know. I'll get back into that. I'll get back into that a little bit later. I'll circle back to that point, because there were a few moments where I actually got pretty emotional reading this, and
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you had a similar kind of experience.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I had watched, I think about a year ago, I had watched that documentary concerning violence, about 9 vignettes of the African liberation struggle. And they're using predominantly this text, his chapter concerning violence, as like a narration through these different iterations of African liberation struggle. And what was interesting to me when I watched that was, out of the 9 vignettes, Algeria was never used as an example.
Oh.
Just prove, kind of the strength of his work. Back even then, right in the like third world revolutionary period, the decolonization period, and even now, it's like, Jesus. I mean,
it's like 1-to-1, yeah.
Yeah, it's like Fanon knew almost too much. Because it always makes me wonder. It's like, Jesus. I mean, he died at 36.
That blows my mind.
Severe leukemia. I know, it's absolutely horrible. And in this very short time of his life, as not only a psychiatrist, but a theorist, a philosopher, what he was able to contribute to the world. I mean, he literally shook it. And I mean, people really, and we'll see later, other groups around the world, like the Panthers, for instance, I mean, they took this stuff to heart. And like you were saying, how you felt emotional. I mean, we're talking about like psychological damage.
Yeah.
A lot of it is like, if it's not checked, I mean, it's a pretty bad turnout for you.
Jesus,
and it's been historically documented what can and is happening because of it.
Yeah, and he has that chapter as well. I think I'm not sure if it's the second last or last chapter, where he goes like on a case-by-case basis looking at the psychological impacts of colonialism, not only on the colonized subjects but also on the colonizers as well.
Yes.
So just the negative impact it has on absolutely everyone. The horrific effects, you know. And it's like a case by case study, you know, of people who are in this psychiatric ward, and it's some of the most horrific stuff. You can't even imagine the traumas that people are experiencing as a result of the colonial process. Not only the war of liberation, but like the oppression involved. You know, you see people being written about like torturers, for example, torturers who work for the French and stuff like that. And you know, you hear kids trying to take out their anti-colonial anger. There's like a couple of kids who want to kill like some Europeans. They see some French people, and they kill their friend, you know, as an expression of anti-colonialism. They literally kill someone who was actually they considered their friend, you know. And it's so intense. You just read these things and you're just, it's, I don't know. It's, again, I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit here.
You're good. I mean, it's literal nightmare fuel. And for people who want to know where that section is, this is colonial war and mental disorders. That's the second to last chapter. And he's got A through D, these like series of case studies. And that's very important to know, right? Because he was a psychiatrist. He got sent down to Algeria, and there he was treating both, you know, torturers and, you know, French imperialists as well as Algerian victims. Yeah. And it became a point for him that he could not, you know, he would join the FLN and would realize, you know, I can't even keep being in this practice. I cannot be indirectly supporting this imperialism just by providing treatment. And if you don't mind, I wanted to read an excerpt of his like resignation letter.
Please.
So his letter of resignation to the resident minister would become an influential text of its own in anti-colonialist circles. It reads, "There comes a time when silence becomes dishonesty. The ruling intentions of personal existence are not in accord with the permanent assaults on the most commonplace values. For many months, my conscience has been the seat of unpardonable debates, and the conclusion is the determination not to despair of man, in other words, of myself. The decision I have reached is that I cannot continue to bear a responsibility at no matter what cost, on the false pretext that there is nothing else to be done." And I mean, like, Jesus, he was about it. He really was about it. He's like, you think this is a game? Yeah. And he took it to the end of the line, of which we will see further on in this text. And for folks who, you know, I want to show them real quick in case they don't know what it is we're talking about. One of the books I'm using as a guide through this discussion and guide through my study of Fanon is Meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, New African Revolutionary Writings by James Yaki Sales. If you have found yourself struggling with the Wretched of the Earth, you will need this. And I promise you, you will be so much further off than even I was. I wish I had known about this years ago.
I've only read a small little bit of sales text, and it's when I read that, it's kind of like being at a book club, like a reading group with someone who's way smarter than you.
Yeah, and it's really great. I mean, the title is Meditations, and you know, I mean, really think about that. There, I mean, by paragraph, in this work, there is just so much to break down. And I don't know how you want to go in this conversation, but one thing I did want to get into is kind of what are the like key messages that Fanon is trying to get to us through this text.
Yes, definitely. I've realized that we didn't really give a proper, we didn't really situate this book. It might be useful for people who haven't read the text, just to know like a little bit about like Frantz Fanon. I actually have to Google. I know he's from a Caribbean island,
Martinique.
That like so Martinique. He's from Martinique, but he joined the Algerian Liberation Front.
Yes.
And so he got very much involved in the Algerian struggle from there. This book. It's not like it's obviously we can say like it's nonfiction, but it's really a series of essays. It's not necessary. And actually, Sales kind of recommends that you read them in a particular order. I think it's like 1, 2, 5, then 3, 4, and 6. But it's a series of revolutionary essays that Fanon has put out, and it deals with some really important topics for anyone who takes seriously decolonization and anti-colonialism, dealing with topics like revolutionary violence, the limits of spontaneity, national consciousness over the development of a national struggle, and decolonization. He deals with national culture and colonialism and mental illness. So all of these topics are very much dealt with, and as Brianna said, like it's kind of like it's like a compressed document.
Yeah.
And like you can kind of unzip it, and well, it's a relatively short text. You can get so much out of it, and every time you read it, you'll pick up something new, and so 10 people will read it and will come away with 10 different interpretations and 10 different readings, and so yeah, we're all struggling with it. And that's actually one of the things that you mentioned, I think, in one of your recent videos, is that this is a text you wrestle with.
Yes. This was not an easy book for me at all. And I credit this in my video partially to the translation. Really. The translation will have you fucked up. If you're reading the Richard Philcox one, you are entitled to financial and emotional compensation. That is horrible. And I've tried to read it several times. The whole, gimmick of that particular edition is it's 21st century updated language. What is wrong with the original English translation from Constance Farrington? Like what is missing in that one? And I feel like the Philcox one inadvertently kind of smooths over the kind of harshness, the necessary harshness of the Farrington. And so don't get me started on the Philcox, because we're not going to stop. But translation is really important. I think that will really help you. I mean, it helped me substantially.
Yeah.
Because I was like, so many people talk about this text, and when I read it, I was like, I'm not disbelieving people, but I'm not seeing it. It's not clicking, it's not getting through. But when I got and this is the Farrington here, when I got this, I was like, okay, now I understand. At least, at the base level, which that's just telling how it was a struggle to get the base level understanding. So take care of yourself. Be sure to get the Farrington. But if you somehow love the Philcox, go with it. But personally, I think Farrington gets to the tone that Fanon was trying to express to us.
Thankfully, the latter text is the one that I read, and I still struggled with it, and I still do struggle with it. I'm still very much at the base level that you have mentioned. But it's a book that I've also kind of been struggling with for a couple of years at this stage. I've read through it twice, but I don't think I've really gotten through it. Every time I read it, I feel I pick up something new. I realize all these different blind spots, things that I missed the first time, and but it is a book that's been very much in the consciousness for me, like as an Irish person who's studied like Irish national liberation. Like I'd read books from people who were in the IRA, and they'd be like quoting this exact text. Like for example, Tommy McCartney's book from IRA from Insurrection to Parliament. Like he literally quotes concerning violence in that. And so these connections are always kind of emerging with the anti-colonial struggle all over the world, and it really here's something for people who know a little bit about the Irish national struggle. If I can just take it like a little detour for a second and just
go ahead
while I'm talking about like the IRA here and stuff like that, I want to just read this little passage, and it's a passage that a lot of people do read, and I, coming from this perspective of Irish national liberation, it means something very particular to me. And if you know a little bit about Ireland, if you know a little bit about the crazy amounts of sectarianism, the fratricidal impulses within the Republican movement, how it's just been like bloodbaths, we've just been like killing each other, and how horrific it has been. This little passage here is going to mean, well, a lot. So just have a little read of this. This is from concerning violence. It's page 17 and 18 of the text I have here. Now, at the individual level, we witness a genuine negation of common sense, whereas the colonist or police officer can beat the colonized subject day in and day out, insult him and shove him to his knees. It is not uncommon to see the colonized subject draw his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive look from another colonized subject. For the colonized subject's last resort is to defend his personality against his fellow countryman. Internecine feuds merely perpetuate age-old grudges entrenched in memory. By throwing himself muscle and soul into his blood feuds, the colonized subject endeavors to convince himself that colonialism has never existed, that everything is as it used to be, and history marches on. Here we grasp the full significance of the all too familiar head in the sand behaviour at a collective level, as if this collective immersion in a fratricidal bloodbath suffices to mask the obstacle and postpone the inevitable alternative, the inevitable emergence of the armed struggle against colonialism. So one of the ways the colonized subject releases his muscular tension is through the very real collective self-destruction of these internecine feuds. Such behaviour represents a death wish in the face of danger, a suicidal conduct which reinforces the colonist's existence and domination and reassures him that such men are not rational. The colonized subject also manages to lose sight of the colonist through religion. Okay, here we go. Catholicism. Fatalism relieves the oppressor of all responsibility, since the cause of wrongdoing, poverty, and the inevitable can be attributed to God. The individual thus accepts the devastation decreed by God, grovels in front of the colonist, bows to the hand of fate, and mentally readjusts to acquire the serenity of stone. I read that out, and the first time I read that, I literally just had to put the book down and step away for a day or two, and I was like messaging like all like my friends and comrades and just being like, do you see this? Because there's okay, well obviously there's the there's the sort of idea that you can escape into Catholicism or religion, which is what we did. We just escaped into religion, made us very subject to basically living under a theocratic state for nearly 100 years. But the other side of it is this fratricidal bloodbath element, where we're kind of allowing this colonist violence against us, and we're sort of just killing each other. We're just focusing on killing each other. Which, if you look at the history of the Irish national liberation struggle, particularly if you look at, for example, what's called the Troubles in Ireland, sort of this period from 1969 to the mid 1990s, you have all these Republican groups and splinter groups, and the death tolls of the feuding that occurs between these is pretty much the same as the death tolls against the state, against the colonial state, the British state imperialist apparatus, and so we were slaughtering each other the whole time, and rather than focusing on the colonizer, in many cases we ended up focusing on, and we still do to this day actually, it's still a big problem, where we would rather engage in sectarian infighting within the national liberation struggle, within the Irish Republican grouping. We see it as kind of okay for us to kill ourselves, to kill each other, literally to kill, like armed struggle, that's kind of seen as okay. But the second we think about rising up against colonialism, against the actual real oppressors, then it's a very different. You see things very, very differently, So reading this text in the context of the Irish national liberation struggle, was very difficult. It was very challenging for me, just emotionally making those connections and realizing the errors and why we had done the things that we had done. And yeah, that's just one perspective. That's just me reading it from like an Irish perspective. Like everyone all over the world is reading this same text and coming away with another interpretation and another just as strong response to that. I know it has a very different meaning for comrades over in what's called now America. It has a very different meaning.
Yeah, when I think of that particular quote you were reading, I think about I recently read Sanyika Shakur's autobiography, Monster, and he was part of, you know, the LA gangs, and he was a very high member during the peak of that in South Central LA and all of that. And, you know, that is also another example of this kind of permanent tension that Fanon, you know, diagnoses and all the outcomes of that. And this, you know, permanent tension results in, as a consequence of self-hatred, which leads to self-destruction, which is the exact thing that these colonizers want. They're like, oh, you're doing the dirty work for us. You know, they don't want us to, which is one of the big key things that Fanon argues in concerning violence, is that through exhausting all means and dealing with all obstacles of the decolonization project, we no longer look for the gaze of the colonialist or the imperialist, but rather we recognize each other. We don't see each other as a threat, but as, you know, brothers in arms, comrades, whatever you want to use. That is one of the key things that happens when we become involved in this way, which is the exact reason why these ruling class forces harp on everybody and make sure they cannot physically move and that they cannot bear it anymore, that all that tension is turned towards ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, jeez, the self-hatred that's imbued within. Oh my God. Even like you talk about these things, and you know, like Irish people, like we have this thing, and I hate to keep bringing it back to Irish people. I know, fuck me.
Well, I mean, God, I mean, Jesus, Paul. I mean, why don't you talk about a place you weren't from? I mean, like the Irish guy talking about Ireland. Who would have heard of that? I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Let me tell you about the subjective experience of every single person in Algeria. I am the right person to ask.
Yes. So you're perfectly fine. I mean, I would like to hear it. So,
well, you know, the thing is, this is it. Like we do in Ireland, like we really do have this strong sense of self-hatred and like this strong sense of it's self-deprecation is a massive virtue here. Just self-deprecation. If you're not self-deprecating, then you're the worst. You know? And there is this kind of sense of trying to. We often, in many cases, try to keep each other down. You know, there are many things you'll notice, just even the sort of the collective psychology of Irish people that are very much a result of colonialism. I mean, coming up nearly 900 years now of colonial violence and force. You know, and like even things like, for example, if somebody bumps into us, we say sorry. You know, as an excuse me. It's like sorry. You know?
Right.
Just, like rather than saying, "Hey, what the fuck? You why did you bump into me?" We're like, "Sorry, I'm so sorry." You know, please forgive me for existing and being here. You know.
Yeah, I mean, people sometimes think it's kind of trivial, and maybe it is in a particular instance. But I mean, really investigate, where does that come from?
Yeah.
Really think about, and that's, you know. I mean, this guy was a psychiatrist, so he knew about people's psyche and stuff.
Big time.
We really need to investigate that. And part of why I think his approach is so stunning, especially when you kind of understand what he's saying the goal of true decolonization is that through this process, a new people emerges, a new humanity is created. And that is something that I think people talk about on occasion, but I mean, really think about, how do we understand humanity? And Fanon argues we understand that through a European standpoint, a European definition of it. And in his conclusion, well, they've done anything but create a humanity. Their humanity has decimated millions.
Yeah.
And so let us not follow into their mold and to create a new person that is, you know, completely eradicated of this colonial world and this colonial dialectic of colonizer and colonized. And that to me is probably the most, like, hit me in the core, this notion of like Fanon's notion of humanism. Because what is he talking about this like entire time, especially when he's like describing the colonial world? It is like it's anti-human as hell. It literally is. Most especially for colonized subjects, but even colonizers, it's like these are shells of people at best. Like this is not a humanity that anybody should ever aspire to, but we should create our own.
Powerful, really
Yeah.
powerful. Yeah, I'm reminded actually. When you say like these people become shells at best. I think there's one point when he's talking to the torturer or something like that, and at the end of it, the torturer is basically just kind of like, well, you know, this stuff. I'm gonna keep doing this stuff, and you know, how can I just be okay with it? Just make it so that it's okay. Make me
like the point is that you should not be. You really shouldn't.
Exactly. We should never be okay with that. You know?
No, that's what this world demands.
Yeah.
And Fanon gets into this in Concerning Violence about kind of the differences between the capitalist world and the colonial world. It's kind of, you know, not to be terminally online, but it's very much Marx failed to consider, you know, what the colonial dynamic looks like, and you know how capitalism, there are things in place to maintain the status quo, such as, you know, rewards for being a good employee, retirement, all these kinds of things in between you and the state. Whereas in colonialism, that is not true. It is very face-to-face. And as Fanon says, the colonizer and the colonized have been acquaintances for quite some time.
Yeah. You know, you've touched on a number of points there, which, you know, I wanted to circle back to. And actually, you know, earlier on you asked this question of like, what are like some of the main points and main themes that really emerge out of this text? And, you know, we went off on a tangent and tangents about tangents, and it's such a great text. You can take it in so many different directions, and you can take it in so many different ways. But, you know, one of the big things, one of the first things you're really confronted with when reading this, you pick it up, and it's concerning violence, and it's this idea of revolutionary violence. And one of the things that you really spoke about there was the idea that a new humanity is forged through violence, you know, but not necessarily that. He kind of gets into that, but you said through like the decolonization process. But
Yes.
I think at one stage he does mention that it's through this process of the colonized people empowering ourselves that a new humanity can be forged. I wonder if you wanted to touch on that a little bit more, because that's probably, especially if you're coming from less of a radical background, maybe you're like a center left kind of liberal kind of person, that can be quite a difficult essay to get through. You know, it can be quite challenging if you're very pacifist, if you're very, you know, peace loving and this and that. You know, it can be quite challenging. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, and maybe as well expand on, you know, what violence means. Just obviously we can think about like physical violence, but also, you know, the different forms of violence, the psychological violence, everything else that is part and parcel with colonial violence, and what it means to engage in anti-colonial war.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I can understand why some people who may not be on this part of the left would be kind of taken aback with this notion of violence leading to like a new humanity, because that seems, you know, on its face quite antithetical. But you need to understand, well, who is surviving in this colonial context and who is not. And I feel like once you understand the very premises of the reality we are talking about, then we can get started. And so if you don't mind, I'll read just a few excerpts from Fanon to get to your question.
Please.
And so our opening line in Concerning Violence is national liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people, commonwealth, whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. And fast forwarding says, to tell the truth, the proof of success in decolonization lies in a whole social structure being changed from the bottom up. The extraordinary importance of this change is that it is willed, called for, demanded. And here he kind of sets a bigger picture of what decolonization kind of looks like, even though it's still kind of abstract. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding. Decolonization, as we know it, is a historical process. That is to say that it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible nor clear to itself, except in the same exact measure that we can discern the movements which gave it historical form and content. Decolonization is the meeting of two forces, opposed to each other by their very nature, which in fact owe their originality to that sort of substantification. Sorry, I don't know how to say that.
It's a tricky one.
Substantification, which results from and is nourished by the situation in the colonies. Their first encounter was marked by violence, and their existence together, that is to say, the exploitation of the native by the settler, was carried on by dint of a great array of bayonets and cannons. The settler and the native are old acquaintances. In fact, the settler is right when he speaks of knowing them well, for it is the settler who has brought the native into existence and who perpetuates his existence. The settler owes the fact of his very existence, that is to say, his property, to the colonial system. And therefore, he says, in decolonization, there is therefore the need of a complete calling into question of the colonial situation. If we wish to describe it precisely, we might find it in the well-known words, the last shall be first, and the first last. Decolonization is putting into practice of this sentence. That is why, if we describe it, all decolonization is successful. And further on, he describes what this colonial world looks like, and he describes it as compartments. You know, it's compartments of two species, of two worlds. And especially if you read Black Skin, White Masks, he kind of gets into what he calls like a Manichean worldview. You know, very clear lines of good and bad, you know, this good and evil. And language, as we will see, and as we have seen so far, is very important to Fanon. Like, he doesn't just use any odd words loosely. These things mean things, and that's why, as Sales argues, we really need to meditate on why he's putting these things in this way, because they obviously have quite concrete consequences.
Yeah, you've got to uncompress the zip file.
Yeah, really. Like, let me just bench 500 pounds really quick. Lord. But and I'll say one last thing here. I think what's also important when we're talking about this book, he is very much talking about a colonial context, a colonial problem, of which he uses Marxism to deal with, right? And so he says, you know, this world split in two is inhabited by two different species. The originality of the colonial context is that economic reality, inequality, and the immense difference of ways of life never come to mask the human realities. When you examine at close quarters the colonial context, it is evident that what parcels out the world is to begin with the fact of belonging to or not belonging to a given race, a given species. In the colonies, the economic substructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. This is why Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem.
I absolutely love that. And I love how committed to dialectics he is, to the point of literally stretching Marxism.
Yeah, quite literally. And that also shows the power of historical materialism. Like, he is looking at the decolonization process through that lens. So me, I'm like, I'm turning it into an audiobook over here, so let me chill.
I could listen to this over and over for hours and hours on end. It's so powerful. There's so much to just reflect on there, you know, and to unpack, you know, and
Exactly.
we're still pretty early on as well, you know. Like, there's still a lot of other topics that are dealt with, you know, within this text. So within this revolutionary situation, as well as talking about the necessity of revolutionary violence and the sort of transformational potentiality of that, he also, for example, looks at the limits of spontaneity, you know. So he gets into he deals with a lot about how, you know, these ideas of just like spontaneous uprisings against colonialism just aren't enough, you know, which I think is something that I think that the left nowadays could probably learn a thing or two from. You know?
Perhaps. I mean, this book was only written in 1961. Only.
Yeah.
It's not a new release. But I mean, it's very, very hard to, you know, not fall into that trap of, you know, spontaneity, of adventurism.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the imperial core specifically.
Yeah. Actually, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, just maybe situationally, because obviously there was this massive uprising last year, you know, in the US, you know. I don't know if you wanted to touch on that, or if that just kind of came to mind.
Yeah.
I don't know. I thought it might be, you know, kind of relevant.
I mean, gladly, because, you know, and I had this in my notes, because, and we see what Fanon talks about. We saw that in the summer, where, you know, we saw this, you know, kind of spontaneous, it not so spontaneous though when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, but this very huge uproar throughout the summer. And the chapter that follows Fanon's Spontaneity, Its Strength and Weaknesses, is his chapter on the pitfalls of national consciousness. We saw very shortly after a response from not only the ruling class, but also what I like to think of as the Black misleadership class, trying to turn back the clock and introduce people to this brand new notion of nonviolence. To say, you know, don't kill our buddies, don't get rid of our friends here. And, you know, when we saw, and also, I mean, with the whole election too, that was also a big thing. And it was very much after we had this whole summer of Black uprising, Black rebellion, we get from the Democratic Party the guy who wrote the 1994 crime bill, a segregationist, and a prosecutor, a Black cop. What does that, I mean, that's beyond spitting in somebody's face.
Yeah.
That's stabbing them to death with a rusty knife and rubbing salt in the wound. And we were told to take it. Like, radical elements were told, just accept it. You know, you don't want the orange man again, do you? Or they would even argue that we were supporting that, which that's what happens when you're in this kind of society that cheers on being brain dead. I mean, it's like, that don't make no damn sense. Yeah, I mean, it's like they don't want you to have more than one functioning brain cell, and you use that one to tick off a box on the ballot that you get, and that's it. And it was very much them saying when Biden and Harris won, it was like, okay, party's over. The weird orange dude is gone. You know, mom and dad are back, and we're going to get back on track. And it's like, this is absolutely mayhem. And then you have all this stuff coming out about Black Lives Matter, the national org, hoarding all this money, these local chapters not having seen any of it, people still having to remind people, do not support Sean King's grifting ass. I mean, it's a mess. And this is what happens when, you know, you don't want to invest yourself into kind of this, you know, Native intellectual or Black intellectuals or Black misleadership class, because they are not invested in the system ultimately changing. They may say, you know, yeah, racism's horrible. Look how I'm treated. Look how we're treated. Like, this needs to be dealt with, police brutality. But they're not interested in the entire system being destroyed and revamped. And I think sometimes those two very different projects get conflated as the same when they are not. And that's a very dangerous game to play. And these people know it very, very well. And they bank on everybody falling for it.
I love misleadership. That I'm stealing that term.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very much a misleadership class. These people are, and you know, and me with my supplemental materials here, we see that kind of play out in this survey by Robert Allen called "Black Awakening in Capitalist America," And that thing I was talking about with like black radicalism and different trends and like different adjacent things, you run into that. It's like 1 degree of separation with these people sometimes. And it's a form of counterinsurgency.
Wow.
In my opinion, it's literally, quite literally counterinsurgent to have a black uprising like we did in 2020 and then have these weirdo anti-racist reading lists, like this anti-racist industrial complex came to like full fruition as a way to pretty much bottle down this whole situation as white people are mean and they just need to be nice and they just have privileges. Not that these people are part of a legacy that is ongoing of literal settler colonial violence. And the police are literally the private army of the ruling class. Like, this is not just privilege or being mean, what have you. I mean, I'm very much of the opinion of what Kwame Ture said, that, you know, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. You know, if a white man has the capacity to lynch me, then it becomes my problem. I don't need you people to like me. But the fact that you were able to hunt and kill us and, you know, systematically exploit us to death and expect us to thank you. We're dealing with a very different beast here than what these little anti-racist trademark emoji are saying.
Jesus fucking Christ. And then yeah, pacifism in the face of such violence. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's like, why don't you just lay down? You know, lay down and die. It's like, you know, sorry. It's not going to go like that. You know, no. Nothing is inevitable. But one thing's for sure is that we can say we will not accept this and we will do something about it. Because, I mean, Zora Neale Hurston said, you know, if you don't document your pain, you don't document these things, your overseers will write in history that you enjoyed it, of which we've seen that. And that's, you know, what Fanon's trying to say. Another key point is that we become active participants in history, that history is not acted upon us, but that we move it and we create it. And that scares the shit out of settlers. Retribution.
Yeah. It really does.
So yeah, let me step off my soapbox for a second.
No, it was so good. Jesus Christ. Oh yeah, that was yeah, really powerful. Really powerful. And you know, I also really just I feel what you say when you talk about how you have these sort of these movements can be co-opted by opportunists of every shape. You said the misleadership. I mean, you see it happen. You saw it happen in Ireland as well with counter-revolution. You know, we had this sort of, in 1916, we had this sort of people's state declared, very proletarian oriented, and then it just got taken over by counter-revolutionary opportunists, and you know, of course, colonialism, direct colonialism in the south of Ireland turned into neo-colonialism. Again, very much in line with what Fanon was talking about. But of course, there is still direct colonial occupation of the 6 counties of the north of Ireland. And always, you see this happening again and again, exactly what you talked about. This idea of there are these intellectuals who come in, the intelligentsia and so on and so forth, but ultimately they're just opportunists. They come in and they tell you to put down your guns. And they tell you to be peace and love and everything will be okay. And we see this happening again and again with the Republican movements. The Republican movement since the late 1700s has been a physical force tradition. It's been very much hold on to your rifle, you know, hold on to your rifles till liberation, you know. And there is no until liberation, there can be no, you know, peace talks, you know. And of course, it keeps on drifting from that radical position over towards the right. You see it again and again. We're seeing it right now happening with the party Sinn Féin, who a lot of people are making a big fuss about Sinn Féin as being this, you know, democratic socialists, Republican organization, but they're not democratic socialist, and they're not Republican. They are not. There was a time when they were a lot more radical, although there were serious opportunist elements there anyway, which would give rise to what we see right now. But what we see now with this Sinn Féin moving from, you know, an organization that was once committed to revolutionary armed struggle, like really committed to revolutionary armed struggle, and not that long ago, you know, just a couple decades ago, they were really committed to that, and moving to reformism, to the center, and then more and more to the right. We see that has happened historically as well with an organization with the party known as Fianna Fáil. They also were, you know, very much involved in the original IRA struggles, the national liberation struggles in Ireland. You know, 1916 Rising, the so-called War of Independence, what we would call the Black and Tan War. You know, against the Black and Tan units from Britain, who just slaughtered the Irish people, and they were quite radical and revolutionary, and they got into the system. They pacified everybody. They said, "Look, there's a peaceful way. We can put down the guns now. We don't need to. We can work it out. We can sit down at the table." And ultimately, they didn't dismantle the system. They didn't dismantle the systems of oppression. They just rehabilitated a new form of oppression, where now it's no longer direct colonial rule, but you have neo-colonial rule occurring and being administered by these comprador capitalists and their bourgeois state apparatus, and you still have all the property still owned by, well, it has historically been by the Brits, but just by British imperialism, now also Yankee imperialism, and now also EU imperialism. So now we just have more oppressors, you know.
Yeah. Kill it with fire, will you? I mean, Jesus. It's like what happens when you feed gremlins after midnight. You know, it's just like, woof, you know, it never ends. And you know, speaking of, you know, back about the summer. So I'm talking about, you know, and people who were watching my channel at this time, like I was on this crusade, and I've kind of like still am on it about like shitting on the anti-racist industrial complex, because I just see it so much in like Bookstagram, Booktube spaces. So that's very much part of like the ideological function that we're seeing, the ideological end aspect of this kind of counterinsurgency, soft counterinsurgency. But I mean, also, what was happening to people in the streets? I mean, people just getting gunned down, literally kidnapped for saying, you know, maybe, you know, leave us alone. I mean, what the hell?
Let us live.
And so, like, it's not a game, and it's really not. And it's what Fanon talks about. Look at me with my segues.
Very smooth.
I know. It'll never happen again. He says in Concerning Violence, you do not turn any society, however primitive it may be, upside down with such a program if you have not decided from the very beginning, that is to say, from the actual formulation of that program, to overcome all the obstacles that you will come across in so doing. The native who decides to put the program into practice and to become its moving force is ready for violence at all times. From birth, it is clear to him that this narrow world strewn with prohibitions can only be called into question by absolute violence, which we've been talking a lot about this, about political violence. What does that look like? What does that mean? And how is it? It is quite different from colonial violence, where colonial violence is literally to subjugate, to exploit, to exterminate, whereas liberatory or revolutionary violence is to, hopefully, if done right, to create a new humanity and to save people from this exploitation. But it's very important that we don't get this twisted, because this is one of the key things I think can happen with reading Fanon. I think it's a kind of a common thing, is that this is a book about violence and how it's great and perfect and all these things. And there's a key thing that needs to be understood, which Sales in his text constantly is trying to make sure us readers understand. He says in part 2, Concerning Violence in the Development of a New People, he says, in the first 2 chapters of Wretched, Fanon emphasizes that armed violence is essential to the initiation and maintenance of colonialism. For example, quote, their first encounter was marked by violence, so on. He also sets out to show and why armed violence is also a necessary means for the successful pursuit of national and social revolution. Because decolonization can only triumph if we use all means to turn the scale, including that of armed violence. Since the publication of Wretched, people have read those similar lines and come away with a narrow or one-sided concept of violence. They've read the first 2 chapters and come away with little more than a belief that you just need to pick up a gun. The people of Africa have suffered for this. We've suffered for it, and our children and grandchildren suffer for it today. So here's the kicker. Too many of us still fail to understand that the underlying aim of social revolution is to promote a change in people and to assist the development of political and social consciousness. Everything else that we usually associate with revolution or national liberation comes through and after change in people's consciousness. And I think that is a very huge misconception, and something that is conveniently left out either by opportunists or just outright reactionaries. Convenience there for both. And so we owe it to ourselves to really think hard about what Fanon or any other text we're reading is actually trying to say to us, and what does that imply.
So much to unpack.
I know. I'm naturally long-winded. I can't keep it cute or short or anything, so my apologies.
No, it's absolutely amazing. I'm going to be listening back to this. I'm going to like listen back to this like over and over again, just like taking notes. And then I'll be thinking, oh, I should have asked this question. I should have said this thing that would have made me sound smart.
I already know. The second I get off, I'm like, why didn't I bring that up? Why didn't I say this? Oy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, absolutely brilliant. I'm conscious that we've been going for like an hour now, and we've only really kind of touched on like the first question. Maybe we should.
Yeah. Might want to get a move on here, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe we'll push on a little bit more. Did you want to touch on any of the other key ideas that are put forward in this book, and particularly like in the first 4 chapters and stuff like that?
Yes. Let me see my notes here. One thing I think would be quite interesting to talk about is Fanon's notion of the lumpenproletariat, which comes through in his second chapter on spontaneity. And how, because lumpen, Fanon didn't coin that was Marx and Engels, but Fanon's like modern iteration of it is quite either well known or used most often, especially when you're looking at the Panthers. So I thought maybe talking about what is the lumpenproletariat and why is it that Fanon sees them as the most revolutionary force in the colonial context. Like I'm running the stream now. Sorry. Okay.
Take over, please. I hand over the channel to you.
You're like, I'm gonna log off. So go ahead.
I'll come back in an hour. No, this is such a great question, because it's a question that I'm always kind of wrestling with and struggling with, and the lumpenproletariat, as I think even the term, this kind of prefix lumpen, it just kind of had like a derogatory meaning when first used by like Marx and Engels. It was just kind of like, useless, terrible, like can't really do anything, and it just had this very kind of incredibly negative connotation, whereas Fanon kind of really reinterprets it, gives it a whole new meaning. And so tell me, what were your thoughts on this? What did you take from this as to how Fanon conceptualizes the lumpenproletariat, what Fanon conceptualizes the lumpenproletariat as, who it refers to, and why they might be the most revolutionary class in these kind of contexts?
Right. And so when he begins to speak about the lumpenproletariat, he kind of first introduced it kind of in the way that and is like these kind of like reactionary elements. They're usually outside of the urban proletariat. They're more on the countryside, the rural end of a society. And he says here, the history of the middle class and the working class revolutions has shown that the bulk of the peasants often constitute a brake on the revolution. Generally, in industrialized countries, the peasantry as a whole are the least aware, the worst organized, and at the same time, the most anarchical element. Just trying to say anarchy. I don't know how to say it. They show a whole range of characteristics: individualism, lack of discipline, liking for money, propensities toward waves of uncontrollable rage, and deep discouragement, which define a line of behavior that is objectively reactionary. And, when I first read this, like when I was understanding, I was able to follow his through line of how he starts with, this is how the lumpen are understood in, industrial revolutionary contexts. And I was really blown away with how he brings it. Well, in the colonial, there actually has the most revolutionary potential. And part of that is because they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Whereas people in the urban centers have a lot more to lose. But there's, again, why political and social consciousness is so important is that the lumpenproletariat can go of either way. They could become this revolutionary force, or they can be used by the ruling class as their army against the revolution or national liberation, whatever cause it is. And so, but part of why that can happen, and it tends to happen, is that, well, people in the urban centers don't even regard peasants or people in rural areas as people that should be involved. They just kind of, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, well, they don't know what our goals are. They don't know what our politics are. So we're not going to tell them, and we're not going to have them around. And so it just kind of like, you kind of set that up to happen the way you wanted it to. And this is where Fanon's different voices of narrative come in about, the cowardice of the native intellectual, the lack of discipline of the peasantry, the, well-intentioned urban proletariat, but, how they kind of disregard the peasantry. But he's also talking about them in a dialectical way. Like these are not set in stone characteristics, but there are different struggles they are going to have to go through individually to start to work collectively. And so that's something I'm still trying to grasp myself. And I think that's really compelling, is that his narrative is not told in a linear Western way. It's kind of, I don't want to say all over the place, but it's not linear. But that's how real life is. Real life is not linear like this.
Yeah. This idea, I love this idea that, like, in terms of like the different conditions, what it seems to be is that, he's really doing a concrete analysis of concrete conditions, and this is what Lenin and Mao and so on did when they sort of reconceptualized and said, well, actually, hey, listen, the peasants could potentially be a very revolutionary class. The success of Mao in China was based on this.
Quite literally.
So, if you can do that, if you can look at the peasants and say, in this particular circumstance, maybe it's going to work, then why not? Why can't we adapt it to take a look at the proletariat in these kind of contexts and see, what can be done here. And as you said, if we're not reaching out to these kinds of people, then the state probably will, and probably will use them as part of their reactionary forces, to quell the uprisings, the revolutionary movement.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite counterinsurgent. I mean, that's what these people do. Is anything they can, get their hands on to use for their own means, they will do it. Especially when Fanon starts talking about, like spontaneous revolts, it's from the peasantry, right, that we see this, that they can tap into that. And it's like, okay, if we develop political and social consciousness, there's a lot we can work with. And, he says here, he's like, it is within this mass of humanity, this people of the shanty towns, at the core of the lumpen proletariat, that the rebellion will find its urban spearhead. For the lumpen proletariat, that horde of starving men, uprooted from their tribe and from their clan, constitutes one of the most spontaneous and most radically revolutionary forces of a colonized people. Like,
The way he writes, he's got such a sharp, evocative, illustrative way of writing. The spearhead. Oh, I love this so
I
much.
know.
It's amazing.
Like, Jesus, it gives you chills.
Really does, yeah. I'm ready to go to Revolution right now. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's make Revolution.
See you later, folks. We're logging off.
We're gonna storm it. All right, let's go. Brilliant. Okay, listen, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Was there anything else that you wanted to say in terms of like the major kind of key ideas and themes of the book that you wanted to dive into before we maybe move over to taking a look at how this book is really relevant in today's world, and then looking at the implications of this text for organizing in the real world today?
I think we've covered quite the gist of it, because at this point I just know I'm going to start getting into really like weird nooks and crannies of this book, but this is just all to say for people who haven't read it yet, it's never too late to start. And also, please do not use this conversation as a replacement, because it's hard to talk about this coherently almost, because there is just so much in here. But I feel like those are kind of like the guiding principles, right? Is that decolonization is always a violent event. It is when all means have been exhausted. The aim of decolonization is a new humanity, and what is required from the outset is a development, a constant endeavor of political and social consciousness, and sharing that and developing that with other people.
Powerful. I don't know what you're talking about saying that you can't talk about this coherently. You've been very coherent. Can't say I have, but you've done a really, really good job bringing that all together. So I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for all that. And I'm looking forward to tracking down these supplementary materials as well, because that's something.
Yeah,
that I need to dive into a little bit more.
Yeah, that's gonna come in play here real soon.
Yeah. All right, so maybe that's a little segue into the next part. So how is this book relevant today? And I think we've already kind of touched on this and how relevant it is, but is there anything else that you can think of that you can really bring out of this book? And maybe if we've touched on this too much in terms of how relevant it is today, maybe we can kind of tie that into the next question that we were going to discuss, which is what are the implications of this text for left-wing organizing in the real world today? So maybe we can take the two of those together and let them flow into each other.
Yeah, because we did talk a bit about what happened over the summer and my extremely strong grievances with the Black misleadership class. But another thing, I think what this book implies is dealing with, at least in the U.S., this very severe anti-intellectualism. I mean, it is very startling how we are in a culture that distrusts intellectual endeavors, that shits on them incessantly, when this is what we are going to need to be able to kind of break the shackles of this ideological conditioning that we're in. I mean, if we're trying to, you look at a lot of political failures here. A lot of it is either people compromising with the state, quite literally or ideologically, or just thinking that you can work within this system. You simply cannot. It cannot lead to liberation. And that's kind of what, again, I brought this book up earlier, but this book, I can't recommend this enough. This is a survey of the Black Power movement, but also of another Black Power movement, which was put up by Nixon and his kind of ruling class cronies as, for another word for Black capitalism. So a way to distort, obfuscate the Black Power movement to lead people to a dead end. That is Black capitalism. And so what Alan does is he surveys this period. And in the very beginning, he's kind of relying quite strongly on Fanon's thesis, because as Alan puts it, he says, Black America is an oppressed nation, a semi-colony of the United States, and the Black revolt is emerging as a form of a national liberation struggle. And this question still needs to be asked today. But whether this struggle can be characterized primarily as a rebellion for reforms or a revolution aimed at altering basic social forms, even so basic a question as this cannot be given an unequivocal answer. And so I feel like, in the Black context, that's what we're still dealing with.
Mm. Mm.
And I personally feel like I have politically outgrown the Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't want people to be dense. This is not me saying Black lives don't matter. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying the ideological and the political makeup of this movement is instead of it's telling us to plead with white supremacists, to really demonstrate our humanity to these people who we do not need to be demonstrating nothing than that we will meet them with force. They need to be combated, not to be have to get understanding or explain or empathy. We don't need to do any of that. Rather, we need to get with each other. But Black Lives Matter, as I've seen over, especially in the most recent year, for me, it is something I have outgrown. Its political demands aren't at this particular level or aren't having this particular outlook. And so, again, this is more looking at history. This is the 60s, 70s. But again, it is still frightening how much Allen's, analysis of this kind of counterinsurgency as Black power is developing, we see the same steps now, even with something as not nearly as revolutionary, with Black Lives Matter. So that says a lot.
Yeah.
And this looking at things from like a Maoist perspective, I mean, JMP, when he wrote The Communist Necessity, he's looking at the context, of the end of history thesis, the fall of the Soviet Union. And so this kind of, people seeing socialism or Marxism as a has-been, it was a failure. Instead of being defeated, it failed. And so we see this kind of movementism that comes out of like the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s through the 2000s. And still this kind of notion of, well, these sporadic little movements all around the country can somehow coalesce to create a revolution. And it's like, well, that's so ahistorical, and it's not a scientific analysis. I mean, would that be nice? Sure, I guess. I don't know. But that has not worked. And that's, it's clear that it hasn't. Yeah. And so in his, polemic, he calls for the communist necessity. It's a necessity. And that, we don't just hate capitalism because it's mean or ugly or whatever, but because it's literally barbaric. Like it is life or extinction. And this whole time, I'll say really quickly, I've been talking from like a Black perspective in the US. I mean, look at indigenous peoples and indigenous nations in the so-called US. This is where this conversation is even more pointed and even more self-evident when we're talking about settler colonialism, which I hope people keep that strongly in mind and has that being your orientation as we think about this.
Every one of those points was just you knocked it out of the park. They were so good, and there's so many important points that you touched on there, from the anti-intellectualism to reformism within BLM movement and the co-op. I mean, as you said, it was a much less revolutionary movement in general, and even still, that was watered down again. Even beyond beyond a pretty timid kind of movement beforehand, historically speaking. Compared to what's come before. And then, of course, this sort of movementism, this idea that we can just all get together and have these protests and, protest hop here to there, and it'll all coalesce, and, we'll have socialism, and everything will be great, and we don't need to worry about things anymore. And it hasn't. It's never worked.
No, it hasn't. And it's, and then you couple in like postmodernism, which is already just, for the most part, nightmare fuel, and this weird kind of like academic Marxism that is really not interested in like literal class struggle, but likes to pontificate about it. It that is also a threat in a way,
Yeah,
because it's
it
just
misguides
turning
people.
into something it's not.
Mm.
And that's where we start running into Eurocentrism and dogmatism and all these things. But I need to grab one thing. So
Yes.
I'll be back in like 2 nanoseconds.
No problem.
I'm a smoker, so I'm like, I'm gonna die. Where is my, so 1 nanosecond.
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. Wow. Oh my God, there's so much to take away from that. And I can't. I literally can't. I'm just gonna be rambling and rehashing what's already been said. So I'm just gonna chill. I'm just gonna chill. I'm not gonna say anything. I have.
Yeah, I told you I'd be right back. I wasn't.
Yeah, you weren't messing. You're straight back. Can I ask
Mhm.
here? So here's something that I wanted to ask, and I've been curious. You talked about this idea that there is anti-intellectualism, and that this can really impede our long-term vision, in terms of what potential solutions there are to our problems. Now, I think we can already say that we know revolution is the solution, the only solution. But I wondered if you had any thoughts on specifically, and especially because you brought up like the indigenous nations for whom you said these issues are often in many cases just as much or even more pointed in many cases. I wonder if you had any thoughts on what decolonization in what's now called the United States of America would look like, or if you had any visions. I know we're kind of delving into, some potentially idealist territory, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. I know there's some idea, some people oppose things like I don't know, like the black belts, national liberation for the black belts, these few states, so on and so forth. A few different solutions. I don't know if you had any thoughts on this particular topic and how it might play out.
Yeah, and first and foremost, I'll say, which is Black liberation and Indigenous liberation are not mutually exclusive. They are quite intertwined, and I think rely on each other, because we do need each other. We really do. And I think when we're, I am not Indigenous, so I will keep my comments quite limited. But from what I have heard from Native comrades, land back is pretty like right there at the top.
I love it.
That's kind of like, and
No
that's,
compromise.
to me, it's a non-debatable, non-negotiable thing.
Mm.
Like land back, and it's funny when settlers or whatever type of weirdos freak out because they're like, "What's gonna happen to me? What's gonna happen to my house? They're gonna kill us all." It's like, oh, so what you did to them and what you've been doing to us.
Yes.
You to have the nerve to think that Native liberation encompasses genocide, mass displacement, dispossession, is a complete projection of what white supremacy, imperialism, and settler colonialism are all about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, for me, that's how I feel about it. But
Projection. I think
also,
Black Redguard said something similar as well. Yeah.
yeah, it literally. And he said something else too, like that I thought was funny. He cracks me up. That like white leftists are rad libs at best in the imperial core, and I couldn't help but cackle, and and I don't feel like, I won't speak for him, but for me, I don't see that as like that is a destiny, that is your fate. But when we're talking about what we are dealing with in this place, with this anti-intellectualism and this kind of refusal to think internationally, how is that surprising? It would be a shock if that wasn't the case, because it is so gnarly here. And when I was talking to Will on the peace report, he proposed a question to me. He's like, I wonder if in the imperial core and here, if the primary contradiction is a lack of theory and a lack of knowledge rather than practice. And that's something I think about all the time. I don't have a clear answer to that, but I will say it is quite alarming.
Yeah. I definitely think within that contradiction, I definitely think that the principal aspect of that contradiction right now is that we need some genuine revolutionary theory if we want to have a successful revolutionary movement. I think you really hit the nail on the head with that hypothesis, especially, as you said, in imperialist core places, and I would include Ireland in that as well, even you might say like it's a periphery within a core, but okay, it's we still have many of the same problems.
Like, come on, people. Let's not be too dense here. I think we get it, But yeah, so that's how I feel about it. And, for people who want to know more, especially, I cannot push that people really learn indigenous theory, indigenous socialism, all of these things. Listen to the Red Nation and contribute to the Red Nation and other indigenous radical orgs and stuff. Like, really, it's a must. It's necessary. And they have a really wonderful tradition. And Nick Estes's book, Our History is the Future, it's required reading at minimum.
All right, well, I'm taking that down.
Yeah. You pull out your notebooks, kids.
A lot of reading to do.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, did you want to talk a little bit more about the implications of this text for left-wing organizing in the real world today?
Yeah. And, I was actually reading another book because, I'm never not reading something. And this is Robert Beale's Eurocentrism and the Communist Movement. I think one of the major implications of which is quite obvious throughout the text, but obviously still lives on, is the need to combat Eurocentrism. And I think what shakes some people up, again, bringing it back to the white leftist deal, is that they think, oh, well, I'm X, Y, or Z radical. How can I be contributing to racism and white supremacy and all these? It's like, well, it's not like an equation. It's not like it cancels out. Like you could still propose these things in your project because we are not part of your outlook. We are not in that future. These people speak of, what they think their ideal world looks like. And sometimes I feel like, well, either I'm not there or I am part of the working force that will give you this little utopia that you dream of. Jesus. And we see that reaction to whenever anybody says land back, you have these weirdo notions about, well, they want an ethno state. Like, we live in an ethno state now. We live in a white ethno state. What are you talking about?
I really have such strong feelings about this question of the equation of national oppressors and nationally oppressed. I'm working on like a little script thing, gonna write a video on this at the moment. It's so frustrating that you see this happening all the time, where people will sort of equate, white nationalism with black nationalism, or they'll say that, I don't know, for example, the nationalism of Palestinians is the same thing as the nationalism, American nationalism, or progressive patriotism, or whatever the fuck the disguise they want to, masquerade it under at their moment of time. I think it's a question that really needs to be brought out, and I think, and one of the things that I think is really important in these conversations about national oppression, is that the necessity of a left-wing nationalist or revolutionary nationalist movement is to end national oppression. It is specifically to end that. There is this dialectical conflict between a national oppressor and a nationally oppressed. And so the purpose of the national liberation struggle is entirely to end the oppression, not to create a new oppressor, but to end the oppression once and for all.
No, and again, it's people being dense because they are bored, or as a more sophisticated way to say that is, it's this anti-intellectual culture. And I see this all the time too. In like another example where, say, someone is wanting to come to the left, they don't know where to start with reading. I'm not disagreeing with this notion of read, Marx, Lenin, Mao, all this, but then when it comes to black theorists, black Marxists, it's like, oh yeah, I guess read that on the side, maybe. But we read these other guys as if, Black people are not the origin, as if what we have to say is something that is just, oh, that only concerns Black people. Really? I mean, have you ever, read a sentence of Walter Rodney? I mean, Jesus. I mean, he's talking about Europe. He's talking about these things. Now, with Rodney, he made it clear. He's like, I'm not talking to white people. I'm talking to my people. But I feel like it's very convenient for white Marxists or whatever to say, oh, well, it doesn't concern us, as if you were never concerned with learning anything from how we see the world. It's not Black history. It is not just Black theory. It is a theory of the world, is an understanding of class struggle, all these things through a Black perspective. I don't know how that would ever be a hindrance to you.
And I also I also want to piggyback on what you said there about Walter Rodney there. I mean, how Europe underdeveloped Africa is one of the best explanations of imperialism in the modern world that I've read, in recent decades. It's incredible. It actually, it's probably clearer, more concise even than Lenin's own text on imperialism, so.
Exactly. And that's why, it's great to read all of it. I mean, it cannot hurt you. But, I feel like also people have an anxiety about reading things from different people because it might tell you something about yourself you may not like, and that you may have to actually change materially. Not just, oh, I guess I'll stop hating Black people now. That's not what we're saying. Like, you're going to have to actually do something. And you may lose something in that process as well. Maybe more than one thing. But this stuff requires sacrifices all the time. And people have already lost so much.
Yeah.
And you can't even get these people to read a fucking book. I mean, come on. So it's very important. It's very important. And, you can't, you want a communist reality, but you can't even expand your horizons of what that world could look like.
Yeah.
I don't buy it.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good points. One of the things as well that Sales did, from the little piece that I did read of it, was that he actually traces even Marxism back to Africa. He actually he gets into like dialectics, and he goes, okay, we often situate it sort of in like ancient Greece, but then he's like, well, where did they get that from? And like, they got that from the Egyptians.
You literally, that's what Diop was talking about in pre-colonial Black Africa and the myth of African origin of civilization, myth or reality. Like, come on, people, please. I mean, you're killing me now. You really gotta get it together here quickly, and then that's the thing. We don't have a lot of time to dilly-dally, but it's very critical to have this concrete understanding. And that's what Kwame Ture was saying. He's like, because some people will say, well, Marxism is inherently Eurocentric because what Marx was saying, or what Marx implies, is that socialism only could exist or was only existent in Europe. Okay, well, we can critique Marx, I think, all day long, as we should, and even Marxism, but that's a misunderstanding of what Marxism is, like the scientific socialism. Kwame Ture was saying Marx did not create scientific socialism, he discovered it. And he's like, because this clearly existed in pre-colonial Africa. Like, these are things that can be observed and were probably documented, but not in the way that Marx had it. And we can also say, if it wasn't Marx, it could have easily been somebody else. So it's like with Isaac Newton. The guy didn't invent gravity. He just, are we going to disbelieve gravity because a European, was able to explain that and the laws of it? I understand. I mean, Eurocentrism is a problem, but we got to really understand what are its faculties and how does it actually function, not these obfuscating notions of it. That's how we start running into walls all the time, and why we keep having to ask questions and have debates that have been had for generations and centuries. And I know this because I'm having to deal with it myself.
I love that. That's amazing. I kept thinking of that little quote. I think it's like the Che Guevara quote, and he's like, "It's not my fault if reality's Marxist."
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I guess, but
Marx
so
got there, but yeah, it was discovered. It wasn't created. It was very much discovered by Marx and Engels and so on and so forth. But yeah, as you said, there's a lot of undoing of the sort of Eurocentrism that we need to work into it, and yeah, as Fanon says, we need to stretch Marxism, especially with these colonial kinds of issues,
And that's one of its, like, I think, brilliant capabilities is that it has this universality to it because it's a method, and it's a method of thinking, a method of observation, and a method of how we struggle forward. And that's very much what Sayles is trying to push in his book, in Meditations. He's like, we are in a society that tells us what to think, not how. Like that, the how to think is something that is just so severely lacking. And the more I try and study and stuff, when I run into problems, I realize that's what's happening. Is I'm like, well, what am I supposed to feel about this? What am I supposed to think of this instead of how should I think about this problem?
Yeah, that's a really good. Yeah, like you'll be looking for someone else's. Something happens, you're looking for like your favorite political commentator to give a good take on it, and yeah.
Sorry, I don't have an opinion on this. JMP didn't write in Millennium about it yet, so I'll get back to it. I mean, it's very tempting to want to do that, but we simply cannot.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how we have fallen into these ideological or otherwise types of traps, is that we can't think for ourselves. But we were never meant to, not in this society. So we have to really struggle against that. And we have to do it together, like what we're doing here. This is a perfect example of that.
This has been so educational. I just I feel like one of the viewers for this one, I feel like I should just be sitting here like watching and listening and reading like as a podcast or something like this. I'm not contributing very well. I'm sorry. You are the you're the wizard. You're the wizard of this text. You know so much about it, and I don't know. I've still got that very base level understanding, and
I mean, you and me both. I mean, I'm just really trying to work through it. I mean, there is, like we said, there is so much here.
Yeah.
And and there's a lot of things I'm personally lacking. So I wouldn't ask somebody to do something or whatever that I wouldn't be willing to do, or try and shit on somebody for something I haven't done yet. But we have to try. We have to at least try and keep going. And it's hard. This is in this text, especially if you have the Phil Cox one, it's quite discouraging. It took me over a year to read this. So, and in the Sayles book, I literally, there's no way I could overstate how much this book is so helpful, especially the way he breaks it down thematically in his like chronological order, because Fanon does not tell this in a linear way.
Yeah. No, I know it is really useful. And the way he kind of says it, I think it's 1, 2, 5, and then 3, 4, 6. The way he kind of says you should read it this way and you should interpret it this way, and he explains why, and he gets into that. And but I also will say, like with Sayles as well, I kind of had a similar problem where so much of what we're doing when we're reading Fanon is decompressing this little zipped file. There's so much to take out of it, and then I found it's like Sayles is doing that as well, but you read Sayles and it's the exact same thing. You get like a new paragraph and you've kind of got to sit down and just like sit with the paragraph there of these new thoughts and think on those, because there's so much more you can take out of those, and it's just like this.
You got to meditate on the meditations. I mean, it's like,
so dialectical.
Oh my God. Yeah, but I mean, and that I think is what makes it like one of the most invaluable texts ever written. And the fact that this is not even complete. Like, he did not finish Meditations. I think parts 4, 5 were not completed. And yet, like, this is such a robust work that it's like he's kind of helped you, you've been riding the bike with the training wheels, and by part 3 takes them off and you're going. And at least for me, it's like I'm finally getting this, because it was very frustrating because, the Black Panther Party is something I've been studying for quite some time, and I still have much more to do. But that was a very, very important text to them, and brings back to Fanon's notion, right? Or at least what Sales keeps pushing, is that political and social consciousness come first, and what happens after that is what we understand as revolution. And so with the Panthers, they had like a reading list you had to read, and you had to do political education, you had to do things in the community before you even get a gun. Like they were like, this is not a gun club. This is a revolutionary organization. And these are things that we have in order to ensure our community's survival. And hopefully with struggle, we can thrive now. But there are things that will have to be done, and there is discipline with that. And so, so I see that kind of example of what Sales is saying is the key part of Fanon's text in the history, the early history of the Panthers.
Wow. All right, Brianna, thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing. Was there anything else you wanted to say on this topic, about the sort of any takeaways that we might have? Anything else? Any other implications for left-wing organizing in the real world today? There's so much to unpack there in terms of just discipline and organization, political education, but also the sense of urgency that we have. Like, we don't have time to mess around. We need to get to work at revolutionary organizing. Was there anything else that you wanted to take out of that, or will we sort of wrap things up and do shout outs and all that sort of stuff?
I think after this last short thing, we'll wrap it up, but I think it's very much what Fanon is trying to say is that, we are our own liberators. And that is not an easy task, but it is a necessary one to live, because what we're in, is not livable. This is a road to death. Like, the U.S. is a death cult. And so something else has to be done. And I urge you, especially if this book has been hard for you, if you have other texts that are hard, I mean, that's okay. There's a lot of things that you don't get the first time, but you keep going anyway at your pace, and you do the best that you can. That's all anybody can ask for. And so I believe in people that they can grasp this. I mean, I've been slow, and I don't mean this jokingly, like quite literally, been very slow throughout my entire life. And
I don't buy that at all.
No, I mean, I really, really have. And I have to do 3 times as much work to get to this point of being able to speak somewhat coherently. And so when I hear people when they say, like, I am really just having a hard time. If you need help with stuff, that's what my BookTube channel and my platform is for, is to assist and point you in other directions. Like, I have used dozens of supplementary texts to get to this point. So if you ever need help, hit me up. We'll see what we can do, and just keep doing it. What did Nike say? Just do it. It's the only decent thing they've ever done. Just do it.
Just do it. Dare to struggle.
Yeah.
Dare to win.
Yeah, literally.
So powerful, absolutely amazing, and really inspirational. I too am someone who has really struggled with a lot of this stuff. I really struggle with theory. I think I was saying to you as well, in private, I've mentioned this a couple of times as well, where I really struggle with reading. Like, anytime I want to read a text, I need to have and for years I would just listen to an audiobook and read at the same time. No, I don't know if I've got something up. A lot of the time when people describe ADHD symptoms or something like that, it often kind of makes sense to me. I kind of listen, I'm like, yeah, that kind of sounds like what I have, but I haven't been diagnosed. I can't say anything. But basically, I can't sit down and read a text without hearing the audio at the same time. And now, luckily nowadays, I've got a little screen reader thing, so I can use a screen reader, and that'll sort of guide me through it, and it's great. It's just it's a little app that I have on my phone and does that, and it's great.
Exactly. So, figure out what works for you. You know, what may work for me may not work for others. What works for others may not work for me, but find something that does, and you'll be surprised where you're going to go from there.
Definitely. And it could even just be joining reading groups, or getting involved with an organization where people, because I always have this issue, and again, it's the same thing, struggling with texts, is like I can read the same text like 3 times over and still not understand it half as well as someone else who's just a better reader. They just get it, you know. And you go to a
Yeah.
book, a group, a reading group, and you hear their perspectives, and you're just like, wow, I didn't think of it from that perspective. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that. And you know, so even that kind of stuff can really, really help. And you know, you can absorb the information in other ways. There's other ways as well. You know, you've got you know, your podcasts and stuff like that as well. Now you've got other avenues for learning. But we have to work. You know, we have to keep struggling at these things and keep pushing forward and reaching out the comrades who can help out, and we'll get there. We'll get there together. So
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself.
okay, Brianna, thank you so much. Just before we wrap up, do you want to shout out any upcoming work, upcoming projects, and so on and so forth?
Well, I am in the middle of a hiatus on my channel, actually, to do what we've been talking about, study. So I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. We got to rewind a little bit. So I do have things up my sleeve, but I'm not going to give a definite time. But look forward to it. I'm much more active on my Instagram. Like which is Rad Reads 94, all one word. So check me out on IG. I have things coming up through there. I want to thank 2 particular people that I can name. I know several other people have helped me with this text, but I want to thank Simba, young Simba, when they were doing the Settlers read along. They really helped me grasp some really important stuff in Wretched. And I also want to thank Kyle at Labor Kyle for always being encouraging. And just dozens of other people have helped me work through it. And it's a team effort, and it does not go unnoticed or unappreciated. So I want to thank them. And thank you for having me on, and your viewers and stuff. It's been really great to be on here. And this is my favorite live stream I've done so far. So
wow, that's a massive compliment. Thank you so much, and you've done really, really good live streams. I loved your live stream on Peace Report. I thought it was amazing and a great text that you've covered. You've covered it really, really well. This has been a ton of fun for me. Thank you so much. I absolutely love young Simba and Labor Carl.
Yes.
They are just
the goats.
the best, the greatest, absolutely greatest of all time, 100%. I adore them. They're fantastic, and I'm so appreciative for you coming on and really educating me and helping me to come to grasps with this text. You know, you've given me so much to work with now, and I'm gonna go back and read it again, and you know, keep on you know, diving into it and decompressing that little zip file.
Yeah, decompressing for sure.
To use my nerd analogy.
Well, so, the feeling is mutual, so thank you.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this, Brianna. And thank you to everybody who's stuck around and who has watched this with us and been here. I see a few the regular comrades in the live chat there, like Ian McShay, Major Hydraulic, Omega CJS, Unpredictable Axolotl, I can't pronounce that. Red Fenian Punk, Against Japanism, amazing podcast.
Yes, Against Japanism.
Amazing, so good. Everybody please check out Against Japanism. Really, really good podcast, and it'll give you a totally different perspective on Japanese imperialism, which maybe you're not really aware of. I certainly wasn't. Ian McShay, and just all these great people here. Ian McShay, Derek Johnson, Wade Horn, Vault EM, all of you. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you've got something from this. Hope you found this useful, and I'll be back on Friday with a little video, a little Socialism 101 video on contradiction. So I hope you can check that out if you get some time. Please do subscribe to Brianna's channel. I will put the little Instagram link in the description box below, but for now I think you can follow on Twitter and the YouTube channel to find them linked below, and we'll update this accordingly. All right, everybody, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun, and have an enjoyable, no, not just enjoyable, have a great week. Take care, everybody. Cheers. Agus long go fóill.